The streets of Tehran are burning tonight. What you are about to witness is not just another protest. This is the beginning of a potential regime collapse unfolding in real time. I'm Nora Blake, and this is Nora Blake, where we bring you the unfiltered truth about global conflicts and geopolitical shifts that mainstream media won't show you. Before we dive into this critical analysis, I need you to do something important. Hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and when we're done, share this video everywhere. The algorithm suppresses content like this, but together we can force the truth into the light. Now let's talk about what's really happening in Iran. The wave of unrest that swept through Iran has returned with unprecedented force. On January 17th, the regime declared martial law, claiming full control of the situation. But the images we've verified tell a completely different story. Today, hundreds of thousands of Iranians are flooding the streets of Tehran, demanding the overthrow of the government. The tension on the ground has reached levels that security forces can no longer contain. The regime's narrative about stability was shattered when footage emerged showing the Leader Bank headquarters consumed by flames. Tax administration buildings across the city were set ablaze. But what happened next crossed a line that many thought impossible. The Iron Fist Basij headquarters, the regime's most feared paramilitary stronghold, was stormed by protesters. They set the building on fire and freed political prisoners held inside. These are not rumors or unverified claims. We have received an authenticated footage from the morning of January 18th that documents the scale of violence breaking through the information blackout. Panoramic shots taken from elevated positions across Tehran reveal dense columns of black smoke rising from multiple districts simultaneously. This is not random vandalism. This is coordinated strategic action. The smoke comes from government buildings, financial institutions, and security installations deliberately targeted by organized groups. The leaked imagery proves that Tehran's streets have transformed into a battleground where the regime has lost operational control. What we present here is not advocacy for any political faction. This is an analysis of a deepening humanitarian and political crisis that could reshape the entire region. The selection of targets reveals a clear pattern. Iranians are systematically dismantling the institutions they believe have stolen their wealth and destroyed their future. The protests that erupted on the night of January 18th represent a fundamental shift in tactics and intensity. According to opposition sources whose footage we have cross-referenced and verified, a Basij headquarters in central Tehran was surrounded by thousands of protesters. The Basiji militias, unleashed onto the streets under Khamenei's martial law decree, could not hold their position against the overwhelming numbers. Citizens breached the building's defenses, set fire to the structure, and most critically, liberated political prisoners detained inside. This single event represents a personal humiliation for Khamenei himself. It signals the collapse of the enforcement mechanism he has called the nation's shield. This is the moment when the cycle of fear that has sustained the regime since 1979 was fundamentally broken. The population is no longer running from the security apparatus. They are hunting it down. The fall of a Basij headquarters explains the panic emanating from regime officials. The night of January 17th through 18th was not just about protests in the streets. It was a calculated assault on the financial and administrative backbone of the Iranian state. The fact that Leader Bank and tax administration buildings became primary targets shows that this movement has evolved beyond political slogans. Leader Bank is not merely a financial institution in Iran. For ordinary Iranians, it symbolizes elite corruption and the mechanism through which regime insiders move capital out of reach of common citizens. Nighttime footage captured from moving vehicles shows massive flames spreading from the ground floor through multiple stories of the bank building. These are not spontaneous acts of rage. This is strategic infrastructure warfare. What we are witnessing is the physical manifestation of what economists call a bank run, except instead of withdrawing deposits, the The public is destroying the institution itself. Realizing their savings have already been stolen or evaporated through regime mismanagement, protesters appear focused on erasing debt records and wiping the financial system's memory clean. The same pattern is playing out at tax administration facilities. Footage shot from high vantage points shows flames erupting from rooftops and windows, confirming that the state's revenue collection apparatus has been directly targeted. Burning the tax office strikes at the most fundamental function of any government, its ability to extract resources from the population and maintain legitimacy through that process. Meanwhile, state media infrastructure has also come under attack. Protesters stormed the state television broadcasting center in Isfahan province. Shared images show satellite equipment and communication systems engulfed in fire. These actions reveal that protesters are not simply expressing anger. They are executing a suffocation strategy designed to paralyze the mechanisms through which the state operates and communicates with the population. In the Saadat Abad district, regime security vehicles were set ablaze, turning entire streets into corridors of fire. This demonstrates that security forces have lost territorial control. When armored vehicles cannot be protected, defending government buildings becomes operationally impossible. At this critical juncture, a darker element has entered the equation, fundamentally altering the balance of power on the ground: foreign militias. There are credible indications that the Iranian regime's confidence in its own police and Basij forces has completely eroded. Open-source intelligence and field reports confirm that Shiite militias from Iraq, the Afghan-origin Fatimiyun brigades, and Pakistani-origin Zainabiyun units have been deployed inside Iranian territory. Security analysts interpret this as an admission of the regime's failure to maintain internal order using domestic forces. This represents one of the most desperate positions a government can find itself in, deploying foreign mercenaries who share neither language nor culture to suppress your own population. While the regime publicly claims to be restoring order, it is effectively transforming the country into an occupied zone. The presence of these foreign elements has intensified the confrontations and merged the population's anger with a nationalist response against what many now view as an invasion. From a tactical perspective, the regime's information blackout strategy has backfired. Rather than stopping intelligence from flowing out, it created a vacuum that filled with speculation and fear. But the leaked imagery has torn down that veil. The declaration of martial law, the internet shutdown, and the deployment of foreign militias indicate the regime has exhausted all conventional tools of repression. Yet every building burning in Tehran's streets, every slogan chanted in defiance, every image smuggled out proves these tools no longer function as intended. Nighttime footage shows moments when crowds responded to police with laser pointers, fireworks, and improvised explosive devices, forcing security units into tactical retreat. This indicates that in certain areas, battlefield advantage has shifted to the protesters. This analysis is not encouragement of violence. It is an examination of the tactical reality from a military operations perspective. This is no longer a law enforcement challenge. This is a system experiencing comprehensive technical and administrative failure. The tactical collapse on the ground is creating cascading effects throughout Iran's social and political structures. The gap between statements from regime leadership and reality in the streets has never been wider. Recent declarations by Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei provide the clearest evidence of this disconnect. As headquarters fall and burn, Khamenei frames the massacre as a celebration, stating that the backs of the rebels have been broken. While acknowledging that several thousand people have died in incidents across the country, he presents this tragedy not as a reason for reflection, but as proof of successful security operations. However, data from independent sources points to a civilian death toll far exceeding Khamenei's admission, with estimates reaching over 25,000 casualties. These figures come from independent human rights organizations monitoring the situation. Attorney General Mohammad Jafar Montazeri dismisses warnings from U.S. President Trump as nonsense and declares that executions will continue as planned. But you cannot intimidate a population that has already stormed Basij headquarters and freed prisoners with threats of the gallows. The legal system has lost its capacity to deter. A regime attempting to write a victory narrative over the blood of its own citizens is experiencing the final stage of a legitimacy crisis. Far from calming public anger, this rhetoric is accelerating the collapse. By minimizing casualty figures and justifying the deaths, the regime has destroyed the illusion of the protective state with its own hands. The population no longer sees a government. They see a survival mechanism willing to do anything to maintain power, behaving like an occupying force on its own territory. The statements from Tehran's chief prosecutor are part of the effort to maintain what remains of the fear apparatus. The prosecutor responded to President Trump's call to halt 800 scheduled executions with language that exceeds normal diplomatic boundaries, calling the request nonsense and emphasizing that judicial proceedings will be swift and decisive. This statement is a declaration that the regime will not retreat, but will instead escalate pressure through shock doctrine tactics. The message is clear: we are not listening to external pressure, and we will continue to be ruthless. However, history demonstrates that in revolutionary contexts, executions feed the narrative of martyrdom rather than create fear. What the regime frames as legal process is now viewed by the population as political murder. This psychological fracture is not confined to Tehran. Images emerging from cities like Qom and Mashhad, traditionally considered ideological strongholds of the regime, prove the uprising has spread to the base. Crowds in Mashhad chanting Javid Shah, meaning long live the Shah, and referencing the Pahlavi dynasty represents a stunning reversal. The regime's 45-year ideological monopoly has collapsed. The echoing of death to the dictator slogans, even in religious centers, shows the regime has lost its core support base. These slogans are not random expressions of hate. They represent a radical rejection of the regime's entire governance model. People are climbing onto rooftops at night in darkened cities, calling out to each other in response to calls from opposition figures, including Prince Reza Pahlavi. This is the moment when the wall of fear finally breaks. When a regime declares curfew, but millions defy that curfew and fill the streets anyway, the curfew exists only on paper. The regime attempts to offset this internal collapse by invoking external threats, but economic realities make this impossible to sustain. The burning of tax offices means the state's cash flow has been physically severed. The destruction of banks means confidence in the financial system has reached zero. When a state can no longer collect taxes or operate its banking infrastructure, it loses the ability to pay its security forces. This breaks the chain of loyalty upon which authoritarian regimes most depend. The sight of crowds dressed in black marching through Tehran's streets with the message, "We are ready for body bags," reveals that the population has reached a point where they feel they have nothing left to lose. The fear of death has been replaced by the desire for freedom. These radical declarations expose how deep the polarization and anger in Iranian society have become. They reveal the level of determination now present among the protesters. While the regime operates in an echo chamber with rhetoric about celebration and victory, reality on the ground continues to undermine their authority. This cascading failure signals not just a potential regime change, but the painful emergence of a fundamentally reshaped Iranian society. As fire consumes the interior, a much larger storm is forming beyond Iran's borders. The chaos in Tehran is not merely a domestic crisis. It represents that critical moment of vulnerability that global powers have been waiting for in the Middle Eastern strategic game. The United States and Israel have elevated their military preparations to the highest readiness levels to transform this moment of Iranian internal weakness into a strategic checkmate. The intensity of communication between Washington and Tel Aviv indicates coordination for a large-scale operation that goes beyond routine consultation. According to reports in Israeli media outlets and CNN, Israeli officials have persuaded the United States to delay limited precision strikes against Iran. The reason for postponement is not diplomatic outreach. It is the completion of military buildup necessary for a far more comprehensive final strike designed to fundamentally damage the regime and target nuclear infrastructure along with command and control centers. Information leaked from Pentagon sources confirms the seriousness of ongoing preparations. Officials speaking to the Washington Post indicate that deployment of U.S. military assets to the region continues and that the president is seeking an opportunity to approve plans for a large-scale attack on Iran within the next 2 to 3 weeks. This timeline is not coincidental. The expectation is that internal uprising will severely weaken the regime and disperse security forces away from strategic installations. The redeployment of the USS George Washington aircraft carrier battle group is the most concrete signal that the United States is bringing not just air power, but also deep strike capability from sea to shore. The presence of this carrier as a floating command center for potential siege and air operations against the Iranian coast is creating an atmosphere of panic in Tehran. The Iranian regime, now cornered, is playing its final and most dangerous card in an attempt to survive: the regional chaos card. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has declared that in the event of any U.S. military attack, all American bases throughout the Middle East and Israel itself would be considered legitimate targets and destroyed. This threat represents the regime's classic strategy of "if I burn, everyone burns with me." However, circumstances this time are different. Iran's proxy forces across the region have already been significantly weakened. Iran's ballistic missile capabilities have been tested against Israeli and American defense systems with mixed results. The regime's threat can be interpreted as an attempt to initiate external conflict to halt internal collapse. But the Iranian population in the streets is no longer receptive to external enemy rhetoric. On the contrary, segments of the opposition may view external intervention as the catalyst that brings about the regime's final end. In this broader picture, the Pahlavi factor and international community positioning play decisive roles. Prince Reza Pahlavi's emotional speeches condemning the massacres and his messages of support to the Iranian people are uniting the diaspora and internal opposition. The Trump administration and Israel are using the Iranian people's resistance as justification for the legitimacy of potential military operations. The slogan, "Liberate the Iranian people," is becoming the central narrative for possible military intervention. As a result, the Iranian regime finds itself trapped between two forces: the fire ignited by its own population from below, and the missile storm being prepared by the United States and Israel from above. This predicament reduces the regime's room for maneuver to zero and drags the entire region toward what appears to be an inevitable and devastating scenario. The pieces have been positioned on the chessboard, and checkmate for the regime seems to be only a matter of timing. The blackout initiative in Tehran became a turning point where the regime extinguished not only electricity, but also its own future. The flames consuming banks and government buildings have declared to the world that the Iranian people have crossed the threshold of fear, and that the regime's legitimacy has been completely erased. Khamenei's delusional celebrations and the Attorney General's execution threats are futile gestures that will not stop what is approaching. The reality on the ground is being monitored closely in the war rooms of Washington and Tel Aviv. A regime rotting from within and at war with its own population is at its most vulnerable to organized external pressure. The lights that went dark on those nights were actually heralding a potential new dawn for Iran. The regime may clear streets temporarily. It can sever internet connections, but it can never erase the concept of freedom from the minds of the population. There is no reversing what has begun in Tehran. The arrow has left the bow, and time is running out for the regime now in the crosshairs. There are no safe harbors remaining. The conflict has arrived at the regime's doorstep, and the endgame is approaching. What we are witnessing is not simply political upheaval. It is the potential restructuring of power dynamics across the entire Middle East. Iran has been a central player in regional conflicts for decades, supporting proxy forces from Lebanon to Yemen, from Syria to Iraq. The weakening or collapse of the Iranian regime would create a vacuum that multiple actors will rush to fill. Regional powers, including Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Israel, would immediately move to secure their interests. Russia and China, both of which have strategic partnerships with Iran, face the prospect of losing a key ally in their competition with the West. The implications extend to global energy markets, nuclear proliferation concerns, and the balance of power in one of the world's most volatile regions. For the Iranian people themselves, the path forward remains uncertain and dangerous. Revolutions do not follow predictable patterns. The fall of authoritarian regimes often leads to periods of chaos before stability can be established. The question is not only whether the current regime will fall, but what will rise in its place. Will it be a democratic system responsive to the will of the people? Will it be another authoritarian structure? Or will Iran fracture along ethnic and sectarian lines, leading to prolonged civil conflict? These are questions that will define not just Iran's future, but the future of the entire region for generations to come. What is certain is that the events unfolding right now in Tehran represent a historical inflection point. The images we have shown you, the testimony we have presented, and the analysis we have provided all point to a reality that can no longer be denied. The Iranian regime is facing an existential crisis of its own making. So what are your thoughts on this developing situation? Do you believe the regime can survive this internal uprising? What role should the international community play? I want to hear your perspective in the comments below. Subscribe to Nora Blake right now if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you never miss our coverage of breaking geopolitical events. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what is really happening in Iran. The mainstream media won't tell you this story. We will. The regime can silence voices inside Iran, but it cannot silence the truth. And the truth is this: there is no turning back now. The war has reached the regime's doorstep, and the world is watching.